Good evening. My name is Paul Gross. I will be your host for this evening. Welcome to my CP webinar series, where we do presentations to the community about the research going on in the network. Tonight, I'm excited to have a presentation of the top 10 themes in dystonia and CP research presented by Dr. Laura Gilbert, who won an award for this platform presentation that she did, and then her mentor, Dr. Bhooma Aravamuthan, will be joining us during the Q&A, and I think I've seen her here online. For those of you that are familiar with the webinar series, I always do an introduction for the people that are new to the CP Research Network. I do that full-on East Coast speed, so it takes 6 or 7 minutes, and then we'll dive into the top 10 themes by Dr. Gilbert, and then we'll go into Q&A. Okay, so there were two organizations that were founded out of one event, and that event was an NIH workshop that was conducted in 2014, November of 2014, and that's really where the CP Research Network came from. And that meeting was quite unique because the organizers from NIH stood up at the end and they actually assigned to the speakers that had been invited to the meeting and the rest of the group of 70 people that were there to 5 task forces to move forward key issues in cerebral palsy. And I was luckily assigned to one with starting a national CP registry, but all of these 5 topics were assigned to people in the meeting. And then CPRN within the next year ended up sort of taking them all on as part of its mission. There was another community member that was there named Michelle Schusterman. She had a mom blog called CP Daily Living, and she took away that what the community needed was evidence-based information served up in lay language to really make it easy to understand what happens when you get a CP diagnosis and what does it mean. And then she was very focused on the care and well-being of people with CP and their families. And so she founded an organization out of that same meeting to fund important research and provide these types of well-being programs and information. We came together in January of 2021. We brought our 4 web properties together, but brought our 2 organizations together. We had really been working closely over the prior 6 or 7 years, and we decided to come together under the name the CP Research Network. So our mission is to optimize the lifelong health and wellness of people with CP and their families through high-quality research, through education, and through community programs. So just to summarize a few milestones since we were founded, from an education perspective, that CP Toolkit was launched in 2015, and it's been served up to more than 4,500 people, both online, and it's ordered in print and distributed at hospitals. We went on to release a well-being guide for parents and caregivers and translations of the toolkit into Spanish and Portuguese. And then in 2020, we launched the MyCP web portal, which provided personalized educational information to the community. On the research front, we did do that sort of very first objective, and we launched a what we call the clinical registry, i.e. data that's collected when people go and visit the doctor in the hospital. And that's got over 7,500 people in it. And we also launched a community registry that is intended to capture the lived experience of parents and caregivers and people with CP for information that we don't get when someone goes into the clinic or goes into the hospital for an intervention. We did a patient-centered research agenda that we published in 2018 that guides our work. We went on to get some significant public funding for our registry and for genetics, and actually Dr. Aravamuthan has gotten some additional funding that we might be able to touch on later tonight. We've launched 4 quality improvement programs, which are ways to improve outcomes much more quickly than research, where you take a systems approach to improving outcomes. And then academically, we've produced 8 publications from our work. We've had over 27 academic presentations at meetings, and we have 5 manuscripts, more than 5 manuscripts in the writing and submission process right now. And then from a wellness perspective, we launched a virtual wellness program in June of 2021 called MyCP Fitness. And then we partnered with the National Center for Health, Physical Activity, and Disability to promote their mentor program to the CP community. So what are we? We are a 501c3 nonprofit. We basically bring together institutions, clinicians, therapists, researchers, and patient advocates, and people with CP, all to improve outcomes. We physically have a data coordinating center that that is now hosted at the University of Pittsburgh's Epidemiology Data Center, and they host our two registries, databases of information about people with CP, and we have our education and wellness programs. I do want to make sure I just come back to MyCP, which is a free personalized web portal within the CP Research Network that's available to all of you, be you a clinician or a person with CP. For the people with CP or caregivers, there's an opportunity to participate in research through our community registry, but there's also private discussions about research, about the evidence for interventions. There are these personalized web services, and it provides access to our free wellness programs. So just to give you an idea of what these clinical and community registries collect, they collect a lot of data points or information about people with CP. And so the top two graphs are from the clinical registry, so things that are collected when you go into the doctor's office. On the left, we see gross motor function classification system. That's a very important 1 to 5 rating scale that talks about how you move around in the community. You can see that sort of U-shaped graph of people spread across the 5 different GMFCS levels. And this was done in November 2021, so before we got to 7,500 people in the registry. And then you see an age distribution. And what that shows you is more than 20% of the people in the registry are adults. The lower two graphs show you those same 2 data points, but taken through direct community interaction. So you see the distribution of GMFCS is a little bit different. And then you see we have many more adults overall that are represented in the community registry. So just 2 data points. There's over 500 data points possible in the clinical registry, and different data points in the community registry. So that's what CPRN is. We're focused on community engagement. This is when we all got together in Chicago in 2017. And on the right, you see our team of investigators and quality improvement clinicians and researchers. We provide educational materials and health and wellness programs. We are spread across North America. There are 30 centers involved in the network. The green pins represent sites that are actively enrolling patients in the registry. The yellow ones are sites that are working through the technology to enroll patients in the registry. Red are doing some of the regulatory compliance things like institutional review board approvals for human subjects research, and blue pins are sites that have raised their hand and said, we want to join the network. So it's a growing network of more than 30 hospitals. So a big part of our focus is accelerating research. And so this is the pipeline that we look at. On the left-hand side, we have the big part of the funnel where people just generate ideas that are related to that community priorities and addressing issues there. We go through an approval process. We apply for grant funding. So CPRN does not fund studies itself. We go to other organizations like NIH and smaller organizations to fund our research. We implement the funded studies, we publish the results, and then we try to take the evidence we learn and roll it back into our clinical practice. So tonight, we are going to have Dr. Bhooma Aravamuthan will be helping during our Q&A. She's an assistant professor of neurology at the Washington University School of Medicine. She's a pediatric movement disorders specialist, and she has a lab at WashU where she does some basic science research. And she is also a leader in 2 key groups within the CP Research Network, both our quality improvement effort in doing dystonia diagnosis, as well as leading our research efforts in dystonia. And our special guest tonight is Dr. Laura Gilbert, who is a pediatric movement disorders neurologist. She's in her fellowship. should have edited that a little bit better, at Washington University. And she is part of our CPRN Dystonia study group. And she was a winner of an award as a junior investigator award from the Child Neurology Society for this presentation you're about to see. So without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Gilbert.
Thank you, Paul. Let me see if I can share my screen here. All right, are you able to see the presentation there? Perfect, okay. All right, well, thank you all for having me here today. I'm excited to share our work on creating a community-driven research agenda for people with dystonia and cerebral palsy, an effort that many of you were directly a part of and has led to a recent publication in the journal Neurology. These are relevant disclosures. Cerebral palsy, or CP, is an umbrella term for a group of permanent brain disorders that are non-progressive and affects the development of movement, tone, and posture. CP affects 2 to 3 out of 1,000 children and is the most common cause of childhood dystonia. Dystonia is a movement disorder that has a formal definition that can be challenging to interpret practically for many. But I like to think about it like this, where muscles contract that you do not want to contract when you're trying to move. Dystonia and CP, or DCP, is common, with dystonia being the predominant form of tone in 15% of people with CP. But in research settings, it's been found to be present in up to 70% of people with CP having a mixed motor pattern that includes dystonia. It's also debilitating, causing pain and limiting function. And yet dystonia is under-recognized and often poorly responsive to currently available treatments. The current state of the evidence lacks focus on people with DCP, instead focusing mainly on dystonia in the setting of genetic, progressive, or adult onset dystonias, which is surprising since, again, CP is the most common cause of childhood dystonia. Yet people with CP have a unique set of needs, which have therefore been minimally characterized and largely unaddressed. And current evidence has minimally assessed the concerns of the community directly. But to best address research questions that can directly benefit those with DCP, it is vital to involve people with CP and their caregivers in setting the research agenda. And in 2017, the National Institutes of Health even released its strategy for cerebral palsy, in which it called for enhanced communication between community members and researchers to generate and share data. So then we must consider, how do we involve the community? Now, some of the common ways we often think of are advocacy, fundraising, or perhaps having people share their stories to inspire others. And these are all highly valuable, but they do not necessarily drive the research. And so we wanted to instead create a novel way to involve the CP community. So we set an objective to develop a community-driven research agenda for DCP. To determine where and how we start creating a community-centered research agenda, we needed to identify potential barriers so that these could be addressed. So the first barrier is verifying shared knowledge. So to include people from the community, we must acknowledge that community members have different levels of education and understanding of dystonia and CP. And so how does a group of people come together without sharing a common language or knowledge base? The second barrier is participation. So how do we get the community to participate, and how do we make sure that people are comfortable participating and will feel heard? So to address the first barrier, we informed all participants through a series of webinars to create a shared knowledge base. So to ensure this common knowledge base, the Cerebral Palsy Research Network, or CPRN, created the Research CP Dystonia Edition in 2019, as Paul had mentioned, holding free webinars on DCP where field experts provided education, including outlining definitions to help establish a common language amongst all participants. We then reviewed DCP care pathways and current state of the evidence surrounding DCP. And these webinars are still available for free on the CPRN website listed on the bottom of the slide. And I'll also put up a QR code on the last slide as well that links you to those videos. To recruit community members and clinicians to watch these webinars and participate in creating a research agenda, we first promoted this broadly through social media as well as through professional societies, including the American Academy of Cerebral Palsy and Developmental Medicine, the American Academy of Neurology, and the Child Neurology Society. And we were able to recruit community members, which included people directly affected by CP, such as people with CP, parents and caregivers, as well as advocates, and also recruited researchers and clinicians. So to address the second barrier of participation, we utilized a method that helped to democratize the process in creating a research agenda. So to address this barrier, we adopted the James Lind Alliance, or JLA methods, which is a well-established methodology for priority setting partnerships. And the JLA helps to build the relationship between researchers and community members, strengthening the network of those involved. And so we ask participants to raise uncertainties that should be considered for research prioritization. The JLA method defines an uncertainty as there being no up-to-date or reliable evidence that addresses that uncertainty, or research demonstrates that the uncertainty exists. And uncertainties can include any healthcare interventions. So for our process, after completing the educational webinars, we asked participants to submit their uncertainties that remained into a free text survey online. The steering committee then consolidated those uncertainties, removing any duplicate ideas and any raised uncertainties that have been previously covered within the current body of DCP research. And participants then prioritized between randomly matched pairs of uncertainties presented to them. The top uncertainties were then consolidated into 10 themes via iterative consensus building discussions within the steering committee. And in particular, to describe the prioritization phase, uncertainties were presented to participants in sequential pairs. They were asked then to select the uncertainty that, if addressed, would be most likely to benefit the DCP community. And in this example, the purple uncertainty was prioritized above its matched pairs 75% of the time. Uncertainties that were prioritized more than 50% of the time over their matched pairs were used to generate themes. After the steering committee members independently grouped the top uncertainties into themes and iterative discussion occurred, the themes were then ranked in order of the highest ranked uncertainty that contributed to that theme. So for example, the uncertainties ranked number 1 and number 26 both contributed to the same theme, and since the highest rated uncertainty was ranked first, this became theme 1. What we found was that we had 166 people who viewed the webinars, with participants including community members, clinicians, researchers, and those who did not disclose their background. And out of those participants who chose to continue with the process at each step, so the webinar viewing, the uncertainty contribution, and prioritization, you can see that the community remained largely involved. And there was comparable involvement of the community members and researchers, clinicians throughout the process, especially in the prioritization phase. These charts show further breakdown of the community member involvement and the participants who were people with CP, parents, caregivers, and advocates by phase of participation. And this demonstrates that the majority of community members who participated were directly affected by CP. And here we can see that amongst community member participants, there was comparable representation of people who are ambulatory and people who primarily use a wheelchair. Here we show the breakdown of clinicians and researchers who participated, demonstrating that neurologists and physical and occupational therapists were the majority, with other clinicians including developmental pediatricians, pediatric NPs, orthopedic surgeons, and physiatrists. So we had 166 webinar viewers who generated 113 uncertainties. 113 uncertainties then yielded 67 unique uncertainties after consolidation. And out of 67 unique uncertainties, 29 of them were prioritized higher than their randomly matched pairs, at least 50% of the time. And of those 29 prioritized uncertainties, 17 of them were raised by community members, including the top 2 rated uncertainties. And these were then consolidated into top 10 themes. So by leveraging community, clinician, and researcher participation, we've identified the top 10 research themes thought by participants to have the greatest impact on people with DCP. And here are the first 5. So 1, develop new treatments for individuals with DCP. 2, assess rehabilitation, psychological, and environmental approaches to manage dystonia. 3, determine the comparative effectiveness of pharmacological and surgical treatments for dystonia. 4, improve the clinical consistency of dystonia diagnosis and severity assessments. And 5, assess the impact of mixed tone or motor phenotype in CP, such as spasticity and dystonia, in outcomes and approaches. I've highlighted here now the themes directly raised by community members, including the top 2 themes. And though the first theme may be an obvious research direction, the second theme discussing rehabilitation and psychological approaches to dystonia is an interesting one. And we know that dystonia can be triggered by heightened emotion. So this is a clever tactic and could be an opportunity for effective management without side effects. The fifth theme, discussing the impact of mixed tone or motor phenotype, is also a unique research question raised by a community member that pertains specifically to the population of people with CP. And again, with a minimal body of research on dystonia and CP compared to dystonia from other etiologies, the idea of the impact of mixed tone in outcomes and approaches has been largely overlooked in current evidence on dystonia. And now here are the last 5 themes. So number 6, what predicts treatment response in individuals with DCP? What causes DCP is number 7, or what is the underlying mechanism? Number 8, determine the natural history of dystonia and CP. Number 9, determine the best treatments for pain due to dystonia and CP. And 10, increase awareness of dystonia and CP amongst families. And I've again highlighted the themes raised by community members here. So the 8th theme is another unique idea where even though CP is non-progressive, that doesn't mean that the clinical phenotype or symptoms are unchanging. And so most studies have focused on children with dystonia and CP, and we know that there is a significant decline in surveillance of people once they transition to adult medical care providers. So we therefore have a lack of understanding of the natural history of this disorder. The 10th theme, discussing family awareness, was also raised by a community member and highlights another important yet unique theme. And all of these themes may not have been driven to the forefront of research prioritization without the inclusion of community members. So in summary, our results clearly reflected benefit of a community-driven research agenda, with the majority of top prioritized uncertainties being proposed by community members. And again, this included the top 2 ranked uncertainties contributing to the top 2 research themes. These results also highlight the unique contributions community members can make to research agendas. To preface this slide, this information may seem intuitive to you, but this is how we discuss the additional advantages of community engagement in setting a research agenda to clinicians and researchers. And so when community members are involved in research prioritization, the community may be more likely to engage in research, such as in study recruitment or mobilizing funding. And since community members also now have buy-in, being a part of the research prioritization process, the community may also show greater uptake of new research findings. And this process also helps to build relationships amongst members of the broader CP community, which is key moving forward. So some limitations that we noted included first the use of social media. So the need for community members to have access to social media and online webinars may have led to a selection bias. Another may be bias from the webinar. So even though the webinars did not explicitly discuss potential research directions, the highlighted gaps may have still reflected the gaps prioritized by the steering committee. But it is reassuring that the top uncertainties were generated by the community. And then we likely had a participant bias based on our recruitment strategies, as well as with participants choosing to participate at every phase. But despite these limitations, we still feel that this work is valuable. And we envision that these top 10 research themes for DCP can serve as the genesis for research projects that may have the highest potential to directly benefit the community of people affected by DCP. It's important to note that the DCP community, clinicians, researchers all share a common goal of advancing DCP research. And our shared research questions should be prioritized, especially by funding sources. So looking forward, what's next? So we should use this as a call to arms to support the involvement of the community in the generation of research ideas, not just in dystonia and CP, but across the medical field. So I want to acknowledge this amazing group of clinicians, advocates, community members who are a part of the CP Research Network Dystonia Study Group, as well as all of you. And of note, I have provided the QR code on the top right corner there that links to the webinar videos for your review. Thank you all for listening, and we look forward to taking your questions.
Well, that was great. That was great, Dr. Gilbert. I have to say, it makes me feel really proud of our work. You know, you serve it up in a way. I'm like, wow, we've done a great thing. So it's really nice to hear it presented by you. Anyway, it just
thank you.
Hats off to all of us. Not to, you know, I just think it's great that we were able to engage the community, and you just make the case for how important that is in setting the research agenda. So thank you. Looks like we've got some questions rolling in. So let me, before I go to Q&A, we also are joined by Dr. Bhooma Aravamuthan, and Dr. Bhooma, as she goes by often, do you have anything you want to add about, I thought maybe if you have any commentary, or if you want to say anything about how the agenda aligns with work that's being driven within the network.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think this agenda was really revelatory for us in the lab, for Laura and I, and really research that we're both spearheading is informed by this research agenda. So I'll let Laura speak to her dystonia diagnosis project, but specifically within the CPRN, we are interested in establishing a video registry to help standardize how we are approaching dystonia diagnosis across centers within the registry. And we've established a motor phenotyping advisory board to help determine what that protocol should look like and how we may best identify dystonia across centers, both clinically and for clinical trial purposes, which is the next step goal. So we've already started discussions about how across centers we might look at, of existing treatments, as the first step of existing treatments, what works best for treating dystonia in people with CP. And this is all at the beginning stages, but it was all fueled by you. So it's been, Paul cited that developing young investigators was part of the CPRN mission and part of the NIH charge to Paul and others. And I really do feel like this agenda has done that for me and for other young investigators coming up in CP. So I'm very grateful to have been a part of it.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Bhooma. Okay, let's turn to Laura. Did you want to add anything about your particular area of research that addresses something on the agenda?
Absolutely. So I will say that this effort actually inspired my current project that I've been building with Bhooma. And so really what I'm trying to do is target those concerns about improving consistency of dystonia diagnosis in CP, as well as family awareness of dystonia in CP. And so I'm currently working on trying to understand caregiver perspectives of dystonia, and I'm working towards building a caregiver-informed and reported screening tool for dystonia in CP.
Great, thank you. First question is from Amber Gorman. What is the biomarker that consistently defines and identifies dystonia? I'm gonna let Dr. Bhooma sort out if she's answering or if she's handing to
Dibs first on all of the questions. Laura can go first.
So I will go ahead and say that we're still looking at this. So that was actually an uncertainty that had come up, was looking at what these biomarkers are. And so that's certainly a future research direction. But I don't think that I can answer that question, or that we can answer that question as of right now, but I'll let Bhooma speak to it as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Laura. I think that's the $1 million question that the community consistently highlighted in these research themes. So there are some clinical tools available, like the hypertonia assessment tool, which helps from a physical exam perspective, drill down on what dystonia might look like. Is there a biomarker? Is there a quantitative metric? We're working on that actually in the lab. So time will tell. I will say some data that we talked about in a separate webinar, and also speaking to Laura's project, is 2 questions that if you ask caregivers, now we know adults with CP have their own breadth of knowledge that we have not yet dove into, but if you ask caregivers of people with CP, 2 questions. One is, if you try to move one part of your body, does a different part of your body move out of your control? That's with reference to the person with CP to care for. And then the second question is, if someone else handles a part of your body, a part of your child's body, like a PT doing stretches, for example, does a part of your body that's not being handled move out of your control? If you answer yes to both of those questions, that has very high specificity for dystonia, 97% specificity for dystonia. So that's really benchmarking a lot of Laura's work, and we're hoping to write that up soon.
And I'm just going to ask a clarifying question, because you mentioned a video registry. Do you think a potential outcome of the video registry is a movement biomarker that could be analyzed by computing?
You know it is, Paul.
I'm throwing it up. I want you to.
That is the goal. That is the goal, yes. And I think preliminary data in support of that, we're hustling to get this work out there. So preliminary data in support of that is now in its 2nd round of revisions at a journal that you all probably are aware of. So we're working towards it. I think we'll get there. I think the zeitgeist is there. We're getting there bit by bit.
All right. Amber, I see your hand is up. The next question is for you. You can either ask your question that's in the chat or another one that you got on your mind. You're muted, Amber.
Yeah, how is dystonia diagnosis, if spasticity is present, how is that diagnosis made if there's underlying spasticity as well?
Yeah, great question. And so one thing that we keep in mind is that spasticity is what we call velocity dependent. So when we're examining the person with CP, we are looking to see, does their tone change depending on how quickly we're moving their arm or their leg? Dystonia is something that's inherently variable, but it occurs with voluntary movements. And there are some tools, some assessment tools that we have, such as like the hypertonia assessment tool, that can help to differentiate between spasticity and dystonia, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to really understand how that mixed tone then affects outcomes and approaches, which was a raised theme actually from this effort. And Bhooma, I'm not sure if you have more to add to that as well.
Okay, so the next question is from Paul Stanchus, and some of you have had the pleasure of meeting Paul at our May meeting. How can technicians help accelerate studies and measure treatment outcomes? And I assume by technicians, you mean like leveraging technology, right, Paul? Yeah, okay.
Bhooma, I may have you take that one since that's right up your area of expertise.
Yeah, that is, there's a lot of softball questions from Paul and Paul, which I appreciate. I've been oblique about some of the quantitative metrics we're assessing so far, but I mean, I think we all know a little bit now about deep neural networks, machine learning, this concept that if you are recognizing a pattern over and over again as a human brain, at some level, you should be able to break that down into its component parts and algorithmically teach a deep neural network how to identify those things. So technology can definitely help there. I think what Paul Stanchus and I have talked about already is how can people in tech start now? I think clinically we're still in a space where dystonia we haven't broken down the concept of dystonia into its component parts yet, such that we can think about how to teach a machine how to do it. And then the question is, like CPRN has so adeptly done with bringing the community in up front, are we in a position where we bring tech in up front, even if we don't feel like we're ready to ask that direct question of tech. And I've kind of dipped my toe in the water in that space with Paul, but I think some of the ways we can think about it is almost accessibility of data. So how are we acquiring standardized videos that we can think about analyzing? What sort of app can we get to market so that people can videotape themselves in a standardized way, doing a standardized task that we can then go back and assess for quantitative markers of dystonia? So it's almost someone told, is it UI UX? Is that the term for user interface, user experience, Paul?
That is correct.
The Pauls, is that correct? So it's the UI UX aspect that I think we need the most, is my opinion, that we need the most help with. You can tell already that I need help in general with the tech aspect, but I think that's where we should start if we're talking about right now.
Great. Amber, I don't know if your hand is up because you left it up, because I always have trouble finding where to put my hand up, or if you have another question.
I do actually have another question. Would you agree that like across the board, as far as healthcare providers, that we don't really have a consistent definition for any type of CP? I mean, whether it be spasticity, ataxia, mixed dystonia. I mean, because I have found that. I mean, I'm a healthcare professional myself, and like, you know, I know it's velocity dependent, but I'm shocked at how many people don't.
Absolutely. And that's actually something that, to an extent, that Bhooma and I, as well as several others that have been a part of this effort, have looked at previously, is that there is such a variability in CP diagnosis. And sometimes that's related to the etiology or the tone pattern, so that certainly remains inconsistent in the field. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And part of that is actually we're working on, do we need to be revisiting the definition of CP? And this has been a discussion actually we even just had at the Child Neurology Society meeting this year.
Well, and specifically like the definition for spasticity, the definition for dystonia.
Right.
I mean, because I find that even internal medicine doctors or any doctor, they just all have a different idea of how they label it.
Right.
And they don't even realize that it's a disorder of posture and movement. They know it's neurological, but they just think it's like, I recently had a neurogastroenterologist say that I had the paralysis. And I was like, well, no, not really. I mean, so I just think that's very interesting that we can't even agree among professionals what the definition of each subdivision of CP is. So I just think there needs to be a clearer definition of all of them, probably across the board. I mean, not that anybody's doing it on purpose. It's just, there's such a variation.
Absolutely. I think things like dystonia are especially challenging because they are, like I mentioned, inherently variable, and the definition right now is like appropriately broad, I would say, and due to the limitations of like how dystonia acts in general. But Bhooma, I don't know if you have anything to add to that discussion.
Yeah, I think the concept of subtype is very interesting. Like, what is your subtype of CP? Do you have spastic CP? Do you have dystonic CP? Is that kind of what you're getting at, or are you talking more about? Yes, that is what you're getting at. Okay.
Yeah,
so
there's no consistent definition for any of them, really, or that in general, a lot of practitioners don't even know that it's it's a
subtype.
That they're all movement disorder. It's a disorder of posture and movement in general for all of them, even though there's very specific things that go with each one.
Yeah. So so a couple things. There's some confusion about, well, dystonia is underdiagnosed. We know that. It's often misdiagnosed as spasticity. We know that. As Laura mentioned in her slides, you have a range of like maybe 30% of people are getting their tone types diagnosed, but we know up to 70% of people with CP have dystonia intermixed with spasticity. On top of that, there's a classification system where we tell people you have a certain subtype of CP. If you have predominant dystonia, you have dystonic CP. If you have predominant spasticity, you have spastic CP. And that's been fraught for a while. And in the SCP guidelines, the Surveillance of Cerebral Palsy in Europe guidelines, which is where these subtypes originally emerged, their data suggests that the definition of the subtypes of CP, the definitions that they created, that there was comparatively low inter-rater reliability, meaning practitioners were variable in how they subtyped people with CP. I will tell you that what CPRN is now doing, and Paul, if you want to get into this, please chime in. There is, when we talk about our core registry elements, so when we're enrolling people in the CPRN registry, we're stating what motor phenotypes we see, period. We're not going in and saying this is a person with spastic CP and then not talking at all about their dystonia. That's not what we're doing. We're trying to say that we see spasticity, we see dystonia, maybe we see some ataxia, maybe we see some hypotonia. And so we're trying to be more comprehensive, or at the very least more inclusive about the different motor phenotypes that a single person with CP can have, and trying not to kind of silo people off in whatever subtype category that has inconsistencies around it. And I think in the future we might push more towards that. I don't know if that helps address. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it does.
So let me, Heather's put in a good question, but I want to generalize it at one level, and you can read Heather's question and see if you have, recommendations. As she knows you're not going to diagnose her from Zoom, but I think that a number of adults, when they learn about the underdiagnosis of dystonia, or they learn about some of the characteristics of dystonia, they're like, oh, wow. So, you can take a look at Heather's question and see what you see from that. But I think there's definitely a sense of, oh, maybe there are other things going on. And what might your advice be as to how, knowing the paucity of adult specialists in this space, how might they go about getting a better understanding as to whether or not they've got a minor or significant component of dystonia, and what might they do?
So certainly dystonia is something that worsens with voluntary movement. It could be like a twisting, it could be a posture, it could be even like something almost like a tremulous movement too that can occur on top of dystonia. I think certainly it's challenging that we don't necessarily have the same types of adult medical care providers that are available for this, but we do have movement disorder specialists who are out there that are experts in dystonia. And so that could be a potential option, is if you are raising this concern to your clinician that you do follow with, whether that's a primary clinician, they may be able to connect you to somebody who's a specialist for dystonia specifically, to be evaluated and potentially managed. But Bhooma, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, I think that was great. I think being very direct with your physician, I think saying, this is what I'm experiencing. This is a triggered movement that I'm experiencing. I think it might be dystonia. Say the word dystonia. I mean, sometimes that's the only way to get people to think about it. Saying the word is very important, I think, just like saying cerebral palsy is important, saying dystonia is important. And so be on the same page with your medical provider that this is what you're concerned about. And then I think thinking about, how does this functionally affect me is important. So if you recognize this movement and you discuss it with your provider and you go back and you think about it and you think, yeah, I really do think this is dystonia, then is it affecting your function? If that's the case, then talking about there are pharmacologic, so medication-based treatments. There's, depending on the degree of dystonia, Botox can be an option, botulinum toxin can be an option. There are also surgical treatments for dystonia. that can all be discussed or that you can be referred for. I think because there is a lack of knowledge about dystonia, particularly in CP, as adults with CP are very well aware and often are, you have to be your own advocate and come to your physician with that knowledge. And I mean, I see a bunch of people shaking heads because this is what you do every day. But I think being explicit about those things is helpful. There's also this growing, we hear anecdotally that dystonia that was not present in childhood, or people that really do not feel like they had dystonia in childhood, will develop dystonia in adulthood. And the natural history studies that the community asked for in the research agenda that was generated with this study speaks to that. So with time, we hope to be able to give you that information as well. The dystonia really can emerge over time. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that started with your initial motor symptoms.
So I would add something. Dr. Bhooma, you've been very involved on my CP, which is great. It's nice that I can tag you. I don't really expect you guys to sort of follow all the conversations and jump in, but if I know it's like an evidence question or a, does medication do X or Y, it's great to be able to reach out to you. Dr. Gilbert, I would invite you into the forum. It's a given what you're seeking to do in your research. You might find it to be a very useful place, but there has been a discussion going on that's quite interesting where people have talked about when they try to relax to maybe get a blood pressure test, or just certainly there are like 3 or 4 examples of people trying to relax and finding their spasticity increased. I wonder actually if that's an involuntary movement, like what that would fit. So you might find that particular discussion that has happened in a bunch of examples that were given, some of which are people that are acknowledged that they know they have dystonia. But one of the people who talked about it is an adult who's always viewed himself as, spastic diplegic. That's all he's got, whatnot. But he was another person that described a very similar thing. So anyway, there's some interesting lived experience there for you. And people welcome the participation there and appreciate it highly. So let's see. Paul has a question. Could dystonia affect physical muscle recovery? And do you think age is a factor?
Sorry, Paul, can you clarify that a little bit? Sorry, what were you going to say, other Paul?
Paul Staunches, Paul Gross was going to say, I can say with age, muscle recovery is a physical muscle recovery.
Oh.
I definitely understand and realize that, but having multiple knee replacements over the last 5 years, I know that rehab just keeps getting, and again, it may be just aging. Dystonia might not be any factor. I'm just looking for anything to give me a little boost to keep pushing and get the recovery where I want it to be.
Since I'm already unmuted, I think treating dystonia could be helpful for doing the rehab that helps accelerate recovery. I'm not aware that dystonia itself is detrimental to recovery after an injury. But I do think, and I'm just shooting off the cuff now because the hard data for this does not exist, but I really do think that as you age, muscle recovery gets harder, as Paul said, and as we all intuitively know. But I also think in people with CP, you are more likely to have dystonia as you age. So I don't know if like the dystonia is causing the difficulty with muscle recovery, or you're more likely to have dystonia as you age, the aging is causing difficulty with muscle recovery. That part I'm unsure of.
Okay. Someone's pointed out that we missed one of Heather's, I wanted to ask the general adult question, but I missed some specific question from Heather. So one was like looking at these examples and wanting to know if these examples could be dystonia versus spasticity. So, I know you've got a, I know you're not diagnosing it, she acknowledges, but if you could comment if these are possibilities, that would be interesting. And if you don't feel you can comment, that's totally fine.
I think the second example, when focusing or trying to do something like baking, my right leg will sometimes shoot out straight and I have no control over it. That sounds like it could be dystonia to me. The first example I'm unsure of.
Okay, great.
I mean, I'm also unsure of the second example, but it sounds more like dystonia to me.
Right. Okay. If there are no other questions, I'm going to ask one question before wrapping up, but I want to make sure that the community members have the chance.
I have one other question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see hands. I apologize. There's two more questions. Let me go to Duncan first, just because you've been able to ask a bunch of questions. So go ahead, Duncan.
Real quickly, follow up. Just yesterday, I went for an X-ray. And whenever someone, a medical diagnostic test, they say, now don't move, it's a disaster. When I was scheduled for rotator cuff surgery about 2 decades ago, my first MRI was a disaster. And my physician sent me back a second time with orders to sedate me prior to my MRI. That said, CPRN is only 8 years old, but my question to Laura and Boy is, do we have any longitudinal studies underway? Because I can tell you at the ripe old age of 76, my CP may not be progressive, but my function and my exhibiting of that CP is highly, highly variable.
So I think this is hugely important and something that more and more people are recognizing. And what I will say is I think efforts like the registry that is being set up through the CP Research Network will allow us to be following longitudinally. But I'm not sure of any efforts that have identified those effects, other than I know that Bhooma has previously looked at this and has found some symptoms that occur in adulthood related to dystonia, such as cervical myelopathy. But I know that basically we found that there's just a lot more work that needs to be done in following people longitudinally to answer that question.
Great. All right, last question, Amber.
So is rigidity also a symptom of dystonia? Since you said it was voluntary movement with another movement, but would rigidity that's like fixed and pretty, I mean, like really rigid and stays there for a long time also be a symptom of dystonia?
So I consider those separately. Rigidity really is suggestive of that increased tone throughout the range of motion. It's not necessarily very we think about dystonia, but I'll let Bhooma weigh in as an expert.
No, that's I think and this is fascinating to me because I think there's a terminology issue in our field. I think when Laura and I say rigidity, we have immediately the concept of a person with Parkinson's disease will pop into our heads. That's what we think of when we think of rigidity. What I think other medical professionals think of when they say rigidity is I'm having trouble extending the limb, and then you have an overlap with musculoskeletal issues like contractures. So rigidity from a movement disorders perspective is not dystonia. If you think of rigidity as I have trouble extending this limb because I think there's an overlying musculoskeletal contracture, that could overlap with dystonia. And it could either be due to spasticity, if you have a mixed spastic and dystonic phenotype, if you have both. Or what we're learning more and more is that if you have dystonia that's more persistent, so if you have a lot of dystonia, that can lead to contractures and what some might call rigidity as well. So something that I'm really fascinated by is I think that physicians that see people with CP, at least the physicians that I hang out with that see people with CP, and that's not just movement disorder specialists, that's orthopedic surgeons, neurosurgeons, PTs, OTs, clinicians that see people with CP. I actually think we're all pretty good at recognizing dystonia, even though, I mean, maybe orthopedic surgeons would feel a little bit down on themselves to say that, but I think they're just as good as we are. I just think they call it something else. So I think a shared terminology, a shared language between the community and physicians, but between clinicians themselves, I think will help a lot with regards to dystonia and other things. Sorry, a little soapbox moment there.
No worries. Well, let me wrap up and say, Dr. Gilbert, I did have a question for you. I'll send you an email, but absolutely marvelous presentation. I think I mentioned I would like to get you to present to the CPRN Investigator Committee. It really makes me feel more proud of our work to hear you say it. And I think tonight's discussion was a great sense of how that underdiagnosis plays into people's understanding or discovery about their own experiences. So I greatly appreciate the time, the care that you put into that, and the fact that you are devoting your career in this space is a tremendous success from a community perspective and from a CPRN perspective. And so thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Bhooma, for joining us, and thank you all for attending this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Paul. That was very kind. It was a privilege.
Good night, all.